My name is Petra Ansley. I am 29 years old. And the house I grew up in, the one with the yellow shutters and the cracked concrete step at the back door that my father had been meaning to fix for 11 years, was sold to a man named Gerald Kowalski on a Tuesday morning in October while I was sitting at my desk at work, eating leftover pasta from a container, answering an email about quarterly vendor invoices. I did not find out from my parents. I found out from a Zillow alert I had set 18 months earlier, back when my father and I first started talking seriously about the sale, and I wanted to keep an eye on the neighborhood comparables. The notification arrived on my phone at 11:07 a.m. Status changed. Sold. I read it twice. I set the phone face down on my desk. I picked it back up and read it again. Then I put the pasta in my desk drawer, and I sat very still for a while, watching the cursor blink in the email I had been composing, not composing anything. I did not call my mother. I did not call my father. I opened my Photos app and I navigated back to March 14th of that year, and I began to screenshot every text message in the thread with my father's number. I was methodical about it. I started from the oldest and worked forward. By the time I reached the most recent message, I had 41 screenshots in a new album I had labeled simply House. Then I opened my laptop and I created a folder. I named it Alderton Documentation. I would spend the next 4 months building that folder into something a judge would find persuasive. But on that Tuesday morning in October, sitting at my desk with the pasta going cold in my drawer, all I knew was that my parents had made a promise. I had paid money against that promise, and the promise was gone. Everything else came later. The house on Alderton Street was a 3-bedroom craftsman built in 1971, with a deep front porch and a backyard that my mother had filled over 20 years with raised vegetable beds and a climbing rose that had colonized the entire back fence by the time I left for college. I grew up in that house. I learned to read in the room at the end of the hallway. I had my first anxiety attack in the upstairs bathroom when I was 15, and I sat on the tile floor with my back against the tub, and my mother sat on the floor outside the door and talked me through it without once telling me to calm down, which is the thing I remember most. I am telling you this not because it is legally relevant, it is not, but because I want you to understand that when I decided to fight for the money, I was not fighting for a piece of real estate. I was fighting for something else entirely, and the money was just the shape it took in court. The conversation that started all of this happened on a Sunday in late November, 2 years before the Zillow alert. I was 26. I had been working as a supply chain coordinator at a mid-sized manufacturing company for 3 years by then, earning $58,400 annually, and I had been saving seriously for about 2 years toward a down payment on something. I did not have a specific property in mind, just a number I was trying to reach and a vague idea of owning something before I turned 30. My parents had been talking about downsizing for years in the distant, theoretical way they talked about most things. My father was 61 and my mother was 58, and the house was large for 2 people, and the yard, my mother said, was getting to be too much. That Sunday I came for dinner, and we were sitting at the kitchen table after, and my father said, without preamble, "We'd rather sell it to you than to strangers. That's what a house is for. You grew up here. You raise your kids here. It stays in the family." My mother was wiping down the counter. She turned and said, "We'd give you a fair number, not what some stranger would pay, because you're ours." I said I was interested. I said I had been saving, and I could probably have a deposit together within a year to 18 months. My father said the market was soft and there was no rush. He said, "We'll do this right." He extended his hand across the kitchen table and I shook it, which was a thing he did with contractors and neighbors and the man at the hardware store he had known for 30 years. He did not shake hands with people he intended to disappoint. That was what I believed. Over the following months, we discussed it in the easy, incremental way of something already decided. At Christmas, my father mentioned they'd been thinking $287,000, which was meaningfully below the appraisal of $314,000 that had been done for their home equity line 2 years prior. In January, my mother confirmed by text at 6:52 p.m. on a Thursday, after I had asked her to put a number in writing so I could talk to a lender. "Dad," and I talked it over again. $287 feels right and fair. You'll need around 10 to 11% down so the financing stays clean. When you're ready, let us know and we'll move forward properly. I screenshot that text immediately. I did not know then that I would one day present it as evidence. I screenshotted it because it felt important to keep. That instinct was the most useful thing I had. I spent the next 14 months living as leanly as I knew how to live. I had moved into a one-bedroom apartment with a woman named Deb who worked night shifts as a respiratory therapist and who slept days while I was at work and who was, consequently, one of the easiest people I have ever shared a home with. We had a system. We had a shared grocery list on the refrigerator. On the same refrigerator, I kept a handwritten savings tracker, a single column of numbers, updated every 2 weeks on payday, with a horizontal line across it marking $31,000. The number was specific because I had sat down with a mortgage broker named Leon Ferreira at Midland Home Lending in April of that year, who had pre-qualified me based on my income and credit history for a 30-year loan at a rate that put my monthly payment at approximately $1,847, and who had advised me to bring at least 10% down to avoid additional mortgage insurance costs. 10% of $287,000 was $28,700. I rounded up to $31,000 as a buffer and as a signal to my parents that I was serious. I reached that number on February 19th. I remember the exact date because I checked my savings account balance on my phone at 7:23 a.m. while I was still in bed, and when the number appeared, I lay there for a few minutes looking at the ceiling. It did not feel triumphant. It felt like standing at the edge of something you have been walking toward for a long time, which is not exciting so much as it is vertiginous. I called my father that evening at 7:18 p.m. I told him I was there. I told him I had spoken to Leon Ferreira and had a pre-approval letter ready, and that I could transfer the deposit as soon as he gave me the word. He said, "That's my girl. Let's do this." He sounded proud. He sounded like the man who had shaken my hand across the kitchen table. I transferred $31,000 to his personal checking account on March 3rd at 2:14 p.m. via bank transfer. I have the confirmation number. I have the screenshot of the confirmation screen. I have his reply text, sent at 4:41 p.m. the same afternoon. Got it. We'll get the paperwork going this week. Love you. That was the last time my father texted me those 2 words. Before I tell you what happened in the months after that deposit cleared, I want to ask you something. What is the weather like where you are right now? Is it the kind of day where the light is clean and the air smells like something new? Or is it the kind where the sky has that particular flat gray quality that makes everything feel slightly muffled, slightly postponed? I ask because the months that followed that deposit had that quality, a gray, postponed feeling that I kept telling myself meant nothing and which, in fact, meant everything. April passed. My father mentioned that their accountant, a man named Harold Briggs who had handled their taxes for 15 years, needed time to review the transfer implications before the sale paperwork could be drafted. I said that was fine. I was not in a hurry. In May he mentioned that Harold had questions about capital gains treatment. In June he mentioned they were waiting on a letter from Harold that would clarify their tax exposure. I began to have a feeling I could not name cleanly, something between unease and suspicion, but I set it aside. My mother had been ill in March. My sister Bree, who is 2 years younger than me and who had always been the easier child in ways I will not go into here, was going through a difficult separation from her husband of 3 years. Our family was managing things the way families manage things, and I told myself the house would come. At Sunday dinner in July, it was the 18th, a warm evening, the kitchen windows open, my father mentioned, mid-conversation, that the market had picked up considerably. He said it conversationally, the way you mention a neighbor's renovation or the price of gas. He was not looking at me when he said it. My mother refilled her wine glass. I said, "That doesn't change our arrangement, though. We have the letter of intent." He said, "Of course not. Don't be anxious." My mother said, with the particular exhausted fondness she used when she thought I was being unnecessarily precise, "Your father said don't worry, Petra." He said it. I drove home at 9:45 p.m. that evening, and I sat in the parking structure outside my building for 11 minutes with my hands on the steering wheel before I went upstairs. I could not have told you then what I was waiting for. I think I was waiting for the feeling to pass. In August, my father texted to say Harold Briggs had recommended a fresh appraisal before they finalized the sale price, since some time had passed. The new appraisal came back at $341,000. My father texted me the result and said, "We're honoring $287. Don't stress." My mother texted separately, unprompted, at 11:22 a.m. on August 9th. "Just so you know, we are not those kind of people. A number is a number. We said $287 and we mean $287. I saved that text. I added it to the album. In September, my sister Bree moved into the house on Alderton Street. Temporarily, my mother said, just to get back on her feet after the separation. There were 2 spare rooms. She needed somewhere to land. I said I understood because I did understand, and because at 29 years old with a pre-approval letter and a paper trail and $31,000 already sitting in my father's account, I did not feel I had the standing to object to my sister needing a place to stay. I do not know even now at what point my parents made the decision. I do not know if it was before or after Bree moved in. I do not know if it was Harold Briggs who suggested it or the real estate agent, or if it was simply the math of the market and the mortgage, the arithmetic of what they were owed versus what they would net, and the gap between those 2 numbers that my $31,000 could fill. What I know is that on September 9th, at 10:23 a.m., a real estate agent named Sandra Park at Westfield Realty sent my father an email with the subject line, "Alderton, confirmed buyer interest at $338,000, recommending we move quickly." My father replied at 10:51 a.m., "Let's do it. What do we need to sign?" I know this because my father accidentally copied me on a forwarding chain 3 weeks later when he was sending documents to Harold Briggs. My email address and Harold's differ by 2 characters. He did not notice. I noticed at 8:34 p.m. on a Thursday evening in late September when I opened an email from my father that appeared to contain a PDF attachment, and I scrolled up through the chain to understand the context, and I found September 9th. I sat on my couch with my laptop open on my knees, and I read the chain 3 times. Then I closed the laptop, and I set it on the cushion beside me, and I looked at the wall for a while. The apartment was quiet. Deb was at work. Outside, I could hear a car alarm going off on the street, cycling through its patterns and then stopping, and then the quiet again. Something inside me went very still, not cold, not furious, just still, the way still water is different from empty space. It was the feeling of a thing you had suspected becoming a thing you knew, which is its own particular kind of grief. I did not cry. I sat there in that stillness and I let it settle, and then I opened my laptop again, and I went to the Alderton documentation folder, and I began adding to it. I added the forwarded email chain. I added every text message, organized chronologically. I added the bank transfer confirmation and my father's acknowledgement receipt. I added the letter of intent, a document I had asked my father to sign in February, at my kitchen table, in the presence of Leon Ferreira, who had suggested it and who had brought a simple 1-page template. My father had signed it without comment. Leon had countersigned as witness. I had kept the original and photographed it 3 separate times and stored those photographs in 2 cloud services and 1 external hard drive that I kept in a fireproof box under my bed, because I am the kind of person who does that, and I have never been embarrassed about it. On October 14th, the Zillow alert arrived. By that point, I had already known for 3 weeks that the sale was coming. What the notification did was give it a date, a name, a finality. I sat with the pasta going cold in my desk drawer, and I made one decision. I was not going to call my parents until I had spoken to an attorney. At 6:08 p.m. that evening, I called Audrey Solano. She was a real estate and civil attorney whose name Leon Ferreira had given me 18 months earlier, when I had first told him about the family arrangement, and he had said, with careful neutrality, "Get someone to look at the letter of intent before money changes hands." I had thanked him and saved her number and never called her. I called her on October 14th, and I explained everything in 11 minutes, reading from my notes, staying factual. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You have the signed letter of intent?" I said yes. She said, "And the bank transfer confirmation with written acknowledgement from the recipient?" I said yes. She said, "Email me everything tonight. Don't contact your parents. Don't respond if they reach out. I'll call you by Thursday." She called me on Wednesday. She said, The letter of intent, combined with documented transfer of funds and written acknowledgement of receipt, constitutes a binding preliminary agreement under state law. It is not a full purchase contract, but courts in this state have consistently held that a signed letter of intent plus substantial performance, meaning you transferred money in reliance on it, creates an enforceable obligation. She paused. Then she said, they applied your $31,000 directly to the shortfall between what they owed on their mortgage and what the sale netted after fees. Their mortgage payoff was $304,700. The sale price was $338,000. After Westfield Realty's commission and closing costs, they netted approximately $311,400. Without your deposit, they would have had to bring money to closing. Your $31,000 made that transaction possible. That is what we call conversion of funds, Petra. She said the word conversion the way a doctor names a diagnosis, steadily, without drama, with the weight of something that means what it means. I said, what are our options? She laid them out clearly. Small claims court for the deposit amount, fast, public, and she said, it sends a message. A civil complaint for breach of contract and conversion of funds, slower, but where actual recovery happened. She recommended filing both simultaneously. I said, let's do both. Audrey filed the small claims claim on October 22nd and the civil complaint on October 28th. I received notification confirmations for both filings at 4:17 p.m. on Friday the 28th. I called my mother that same evening at 6:31 p.m. I had decided I owed her one phone call. Not to negotiate, not to give them a chance to make it right, but because I had grown up in the house on Alderton Street and my mother had sat on a tile floor outside a bathroom door when I was 15 and talked me through an anxiety attack, and I was not going to let her find out about the filings from a process server without having heard my voice first. She answered on the second ring. She said, Petra, I've been meaning to call you. I said, I know about the sale, Mom. I've known for 3 weeks. A silence. Then, the market was just, the timing was right, and Harold said we really couldn't. I said, I transferred $31,000 into Dad's account in March. You confirmed the price in writing. He signed a letter of intent. Another silence, longer. She said, we'll pay it back. We were always going to pay it back. We just needed a little time to. I said, Mom, I filed today. The silence after that was different in quality. Not surprised, exactly. Something more like the sound of a door closing. I said, I love you. I'll talk to you when this is resolved. I ended the call at 6:38 p.m. My father called me at 6:53 p.m. I let it ring. He called again at 7:04, at 7:31, at 8:02, at 8:45, at 9:17, at 10:12. My mother called 4 times between 8 o'clock and 9:30 p.m. My sister Bree, who was still technically living in the Alderton Street house, which Gerald Kowalski had purchased and was presumably planning to occupy, called twice and left a voicemail that said, Petra, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're destroying this family over money, and I think you really need to think about what kind of person you want to be. I saved the voicemail. I added it to the folder. I labeled it Bree_voicemail_October 28. I went to bed at 10:45 p.m. Over that first weekend, my father left 9 voicemails. The early ones were measured, explanatory in the careful way of someone who has done something he knows cannot be fully explained. He said the market timing had been impossible to ignore. He said Harold had advised them that carrying 2 potential sales simultaneously created legal complexity. He said they had always intended to make it right with me. By the 5th voicemail, his register had shifted. He said, I built that house up. I paid that mortgage for 22 years. I have the right to sell my own property, Petra. By the 8th voicemail, left at 11:51 p.m. on a Saturday night, and I know the time because I looked at the notification and chose not to answer, he said, You are tearing this family apart over $30,000. Do you understand what you are doing? The 9th voicemail, Sunday morning at 9:14 a.m., said, We need you to drop this. Your mother is not sleeping. This is not who we are. I listened to each voicemail once, noted the time and content in a document, and did not respond. The legal process has a texture that I did not expect, bureaucratic and slow and oddly calming, in the way that precise, rule-governed things can be calming when the rest of your life has gone sideways. Audrey was methodical and clear, and she explained each step before it happened and then reported on it after, and I found that rhythm genuinely stabilizing. I had a task. I had a folder. I had a person in my corner who knew the rules. In November, Audrey formally requested through Discovery the complete settlement statement for the Alderton Street sale, the HUD, one document that itemizes every dollar in a real estate closing. It arrived on November 19th. She called me that afternoon at 4:53 p.m. and walked me through it line by line. The numbers were exact and unambiguous. Mortgage payoff, $304,700. Sale price, $338,000. Realtor commission, $20,280. Closing costs and fees, $6,847. Net to seller, $6,173, which was not enough to cover their payoff. The gap was $298,527 against the net of $6,173, which meant they were short. My $31,000 deposit, transferred in March and never applied to any purchase contract, had been used to close that gap. It had been logged in the settlement statement as a seller contribution from related party, which is a line item I now know more about than I ever expected to. Audrey said, "Every number is here. This is cleaner than most cases I handle." I said, "What happens next?" She said, "Their attorney is going to argue the letter of intent was insufficiently specific, that it didn't constitute a binding contract. We're going to respond with the transfer of funds, the written acknowledgement, and the communications establishing price and timeline, and we're going to cite precedent. And then we're going to let the judge decide." My parents retained a civil attorney in January, a man named Paul Gregg, whose name I found on their first formal response filing. He filed a motion to dismiss in April on the grounds that the letter of intent lacked the specificity required to constitute an enforceable purchase agreement under state property law. Audrey responded on April 9th with a 41-page brief. I read every page of it. It cited 3 precedent cases, 2 of which involved family property arrangements and both of which had been resolved in favor of the party who had transferred funds in documented reliance on a preliminary agreement. It cited the March 14th text from my mother confirming the sale price. It cited my father's written acknowledgement of the deposit receipt. It cited the letter of intent, which Leon Ferreira had witnessed and which bore both signatures in blue ink. On April 17th, the motion to dismiss was denied. On April 30th, my parents settled. The settlement terms were as follows: return of the $31,000 deposit, already ordered separately in the small claims ruling that had been issued on February 7th by the Honorable Diane Cho, who had listened to my father attempt to characterize the deposit as a family loan and had asked him, once, about the letter of intent, and had then ruled in my favor in approximately the time it takes to drink a glass of water. The civil settlement added $24,400 in damages for breach of contract and conversion of funds, plus $6,200 in attorney fees. Total recovered, $61,600. Audrey called me at 4:47 p.m. on April 30th. I was in the parking structure outside my office building, sitting in my car with the engine off, because I had known the call was coming and I had wanted to be somewhere private when it arrived. She said, "It's done. The settlement is signed." I said, "Thank you." She said, "You built a very clean case. You kept everything." I said, "My father shook my hand." There was a pause. She said quietly, "I know. I'm sorry." I said, "It's okay. I mean it." And I did mean it. That is the strange part. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel vindicated in the way you imagine you will feel when you have been wronged and you have been right and the institution has agreed with you. I felt the way you feel at the end of a very long walk when you finally sit down, not triumphant, just still. Just finished. It is May now. The settlement check cleared on May 8th, a Wednesday. I folded it into my savings account, and I sat with the total for a while, and then I moved on with my morning. I make coffee at 6:40 a.m. most days, standing at the kitchen window in my apartment, watching the light change in the alley below. The lavender on my balcony, a cutting I took from my grandmother's garden 2 summers ago and kept alive through 2 apartment moves and one very cold November, bloomed for the first time last week. 3 small purple clusters. I stood in the doorway and looked at them for longer than was probably warranted. I have not spoken to my parents since the settlement was signed. My mother sent an email on May 2nd that said, "I hope we can find a way back from this at some point." That's all I want to say. I have read it several times. I have not replied. I do not know yet if I will. The question of what to do with love that has been stored in a house that no longer belongs to you, that is not a legal question, and no one can answer it for you. Love without accountability is not love. It is proximity wearing love's name. The climbing rose on the back fence of the house on Alderton Street. I wonder sometimes if Gerald Kowalski knows what it is. I wonder if anyone told him it blooms twice a year, in June and again in September, in a particular shade of pink that my mother used to say was the color of a good apology. I hope he takes care of it. I hope it outlasts whatever anyone did or didn't do in that house. There is a legal principle called unjust enrichment, the doctrine that one party cannot profit at another's expense without a legal basis, even absent deliberate fraud. It is worth understanding if you're ever in a family arrangement involving real property or significant sums. A signed letter of intent, combined with a documented fund transfer and written acknowledgement of receipt, creates enforceable obligations in most states. Before you transfer any money toward a family property purchase, consult a licensed real estate attorney and make sure there is a signed agreement in place that clearly states the purchase price, the timeline, and the role of any deposited funds. If you were in Petra's place, if your parents had kept your $31,000 deposit and used it to close a sale they made to a stranger, would you have filed the civil complaint immediately, the way she did? Or would you have given them 60 days to return the money on their own first?